Hello and welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian channel. I'm your host, the Stick Figure Historian, and today we're going to continue the Scotland series. Except for some reason we spent the entire last episode in Italy, but don't worry guys. I promise we'll make it there eventually. It's all part of the story. So, we talked a lot about the birth of Prince Charles Edward Louis Sylvester Maria Casimir Stuart, or Charles for short. And today, we're going to learn some things about him while he was growing up. When Prince Charles had reached the age of 13, his cousin, James Francis Fitz-James Stuart, stopped by the Palazzo Muti. This James was a bit of a wild spirit, Duke of Lyria in Spain, and a soldier at heart. He currently enjoyed the vigor and health of his late 30s, and was used to both fortune and adventure. Certainly nothing like his despairing uncle of the same name. By virtue of his dukedom, James Fitz-James was enlisted in the service of Charles, the Duke of Parma, who would one day become King Charles III of Spain, who is currently waging a campaign to take the crown of Naples. And even though this map says it's from the 1400s, the extent of the Kingdom of Naples is still accurate at this point in history, in the early 1700s. And as the Duke of Parma's army was marching directly through Rome, James had taken the opportunity to visit his exiled relatives. Charles was at once enamored with his adventuresome cousin. He was therefore absolutely thrilled, above measure, when James offered to take him along on the campaign. His father's consent was soon given, and thus the two set off in the train of the Duke. And evidently, the Duke took such a liking to the young princeling that he appointed him General of the Artillery. Of course, someone else must have given more than a little guidance and oversight to Charles and his command, for it is quite absurd that a boy of 13 should have the charge of an entire army's cannons. This was Prince Charles' first taste of war. It was a short campaign, for after a little firing back and forth and a 4-month siege, the whole thing was over. The Duke won the crown of Naples, and James and his cousin returned home with honors and treasure. There was one sadness upon the prince's return to Rome, however, for shortly thereafter an illness claimed his mother's life. Though he had seen little of her as a child, Charles had still been very fond of his mother, and it was a terrible blow to him when she passed. He struggled with the distress of this as he continued his studies under Murray and his other tutors. A few years later, when Charles had grown to be 17, his father decided that he must be allowed to range beyond the confines of Rome and become a man of the world. He sent him off on a tour of the greatest Italian cities: Genoa, Florence, Parma, and of course, he picked up some Parmesan cheese while he was there. Yeah, that's actually where Parmesan cheese is named for, is Parma. Which I didn't know until I started making this episode, actually. Anyhow, Bologna and of course, Venice. Charles was greatly excited at this prospect and enjoyed this vacation immensely. Only he was troubled by one thing. He had expected to be greeted as a prince in these places, that people would recognize the greatness of his station and treat him accordingly. But for the greater part, saving in Venice, the European nobles he encountered simply referred to him as the Duke of Albany, if anything at all. It did not sit well with the young prince's growing vanity, and surely gave fuel to thoughts of his lost kingdom. At 20 years old, Charles was full of courtly grace and boundless energy. A bit too much energy, perhaps. He greatly enjoyed parties, and often drank far more than was healthy for him. He also had acquired quite expensive tastes in regards to clothing and living, as was the general custom of the nobility in those days. He was always about some kind of adventure, and as he had often done throughout childhood, still left his bed in the middle of the night to go tearing on horseback through the moonlit countryside, just for the very joy of it. He was the complete opposite of his younger brother Henry, the quiet, studious youth who planned to spend his life in the service of the church. It is in this season of his life that Charles' wild ambitions began to be directed towards Britain. For years his despondent father had waited for aid from some European ruler that would look kindly on his cause and give him troops with which to regain his crown. But decades had passed, and none had come. Charles was tired of waiting. He wanted action, now. Surely their own people of Britain were strong enough to throw down the usurping house, he argued. He urged his father to try again, to make a new landing and call up the Jacobites to arms. But experience had taken the fire out of James and taught him differently. He continued to wait for mercenaries. The wind of politics shifted in 1744, throwing some wind into the exile's sails. What exactly it was that gave James the idea that Louis XV of France would now suddenly lend him aid, it is unclear. Perhaps there was some whispered discussion between himself and high French officials somewhere within the dim-lit passages of the Palazzo Moody, or encrypted letters that have since been consigned to the fire. Who knows? Whatever the case, James was convinced that the French were ready now to smile on the Stuart cause. He was so convinced, in fact, that he decided to send Prince Charles unbidden to the royal court in Paris. But spies are always an issue. James was well aware of this, of course. Why else must he meet with his friends in such continual strict secret? If their enemies in Britain heard that Prince Charles had gone to Paris, this would be a sure sign that a plot was intended, and so set the country on the alert and up in arms before an invading army could be landed. It was necessary that this secret be kept from King George II of England and the Hanoverians for as long as possible. And I promise I'll explain to you who the Hanoverians are in the following episode. We won't get on that rabbit trail for now, though. Therefore, It was only on a hunting party that Prince Charles left his grand Roman home. He and a little group of friends were dressed in their simple sporting clothes and frolicked about the countryside as usual. Only when they were certain none was watching, they suddenly thundered over the sunny hills and onward, disappearing at last over the Alps. Louis XV was perhaps not all that surprised when his young British namesake bowed to kiss his hand. As I said, he had not given any real promise to James for aid, but he must have expected that things would come to a push at some point. In any case, he received his royal guest gracefully, and gave him a monthly allowance to subsist on, while the matter of aid was considered, for he still would give no promise that anything would be done. There was plenty in the gay streets and opulent palaces of Paris to occupy Charles's thirst for thrill and adventure for the meantime.